What is a Shellycoat? Are they really just harmless pranksters? And what should you do if you ever come across one? Hi everybody, I'm Nick and this is Beasts of the Old World, a channel that explores ancient folklore and mythical creatures from across the globe. If you're fascinated by the mysterious and the unseen, then make sure to subscribe and ring the bell.
Lost! Lost!
Came the voice out of the night. It was pitch dark and the two men, approaching the banks of the Ettrick, craned their heads to hear it.
Lost! Lost!
Came the doleful voice again. Certainly it was coming from the river. They hastened to the edge and looked out, thinking for all the world that a fellow traveller was in grave peril and would surely drown if they could not save him. But once they looked out over the river, they could see naught. Perhaps it was just too dark, or perhaps the hapless fellow had been swept down the current, which was fast tonight. Perhaps they were too late, and he had sunk to the bottom, lungs full of water.
Lost! Lost!
The voice called again. To their astonishment and great confusion, it appeared that the voice was moving away from them, proceeding upstream against the current. Still, despite the incredible strangeness of this circumstance, the two men pursued the voice long into the night, as the winds rose and the rains fell about them, determined to save this poor soul.
Lost! Lost!
Came the melancholy cry again and again, each time further upstream. On and on they went into the long night, till they were tired and untired, and their feet throbbed awfully within their sodden boots. They had followed the voice so far and with such anxiety to make a rescue that they only stopped when the dawn found them on the far side of the hill, and they saw that here the river began to rise. Here it was that they relinquished their pursuit, seeing that all was not right, and that at any rate they could go no further. And so they turned, exhausted and defeated, and started home. No sooner had they turned, than a great clamour came from the river, from the direction which they had been so cruelly lured throughout the night, an appalling cacophony of rattling shells echoing dismally across the hills, undiminished by the noise of the swift Ettrick water, and loud bursts of demonic laughter.
Lost!
Cried the voice again, unable to contain its mirth. Despite their fatigue, the two men hurried home and did not look back. For they had come across a Shellycoat, a little-known water demon only seen in very specific locations in Scotland. Leith, Forfarshire, and in this case, the borderland region of Ettrick. Catherine Briggs describes the Shellycoat as being
a lowland water bogle of fresh-water streams, festooned about with shells which clattered when he moved. Shellycoat delights in teasing, tricking, and bewildering human beings without doing them actual harm, and applauds his success with loud laughter.
And this does indeed appear to be true of the borderland Shellycoat, who we met in the opening story there. But if we examine the Shellycoat myth that comes out of Leith in Edinburgh, will we find it to be consistent with Ettrick, or will it seem to be an altogether more dangerous creature? There is a bit of discussion as to what the true nature of the Shellycoat really is. The famous Jacob Grimm claims that it is one and the same creature as the German Schellenrock or Bellcoat, but these are described as being house spirits of good nature and temperament, who wear colourful coats covered in tinkling bells. This, obviously, contrasts greatly with the local descriptions and sources of Shellycoat, none of which characterise the Shellycoat as being good-natured as such, instead describing its wild, or at least mischievous nature. Nor do Scottish sources associate the Shellycoat with the home, describing it instead as a sort of water sprite and linking it exclusively to rivers and the sea. William Hutchinson, in Tales, Traditions and Antiquities of Leith, paints a very different picture of the Shellycoat, describing it
to have shown himself a perfect demon, a sort of monster fiend, gigantic but undefinable, who possessed powers almost infinite. His swiftness was that of a spirit, and he delighted in deeds of blood and devastation.
The Leith Shellycoat would, upon completing whatever malevolent deed he'd set himself to, strip off his coat of rattling shells and would deposit it beneath a large rock, which defied mortal strength to move it. Hutchinson explains that while unclothed with his conchological garment, the Shellycoat was perfectly helpless and harmless. It does seem curious, therefore, that given the importance of the coat itself, very little is known about how such a magical garment is made, or found, or otherwise curated. Sadly, it would seem, the lore surrounding the magical coat after which this creature is named has been utterly lost. Near the docks at Leith, there once sat an enormous rock, rumoured locally to house the Shellycoat. At one time it was considered a feat of great bravery, or foolishness, to run around this stone chanting, "Shellycoat, Shellycoat, gang away hame, I cry not for your mercy, I fear not your name." It was said that those who summoned the Shellycoat would suffer a terrible fate, as a gentleman called English Dick once found out to his own considerable cost. Some years ago, on a dark night of course, the briny scent of the sea was carried through the streets of Leith on a low breeze. Not far from the shore there was an inn called the Foul Anchor. Inside, the air was thick with the fog of pipe smoke and spilled ale, and the fire cast long, flickering shadows against the warped wooden walls. A small group of drinkers sat huddled in a darkened corner, their laughter rising and falling like the tide. It was a night like any other, until someone spoke the name of the Shellycoat. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing heavier, for it was a creature so feared in those parts that even to speak its name was considered an act of recklessness. The old tales came spilling forth then, dark whispers of those who had dared the spirit's wrath and the dire consequences that followed. The older gentlemen, leaning at the bar, shook their grey heads disapprovingly, feeling it most unwise to speak of this dreaded spirit without due cause. But there was one man present who did not share their superstitions. Though a Scot himself, he was generally known as English Dick, for he was a descendant of Cromwell's troopers. At the mention of the name of this spirit, he threw back his head and laughed. For some minutes he held court, loudly professing his disbelief for the existence of any such spirit as the Shellycoat. When another and another tale of its evil deeds were told, he mocked the tellers with unbound scorn. Finally, he wagered a gallon of wine that he would at that very hour proceed alone to the Shellycoat Stane, and in defiance of its guardian, repeat the famous doggerel. "Shellycoat, Shellycoat, gang away hame. I cry not for your mercy, I fear not your name." The proposal was looked upon as so reckless that nobody was willing to accept the wager, and a hush fell over the room. No man wanted to be in any way accessory to the mischief that would surely follow, or be party to such madness. But Dick goaded them and taunted them until at length, whether they were unwilling to appear cowards, or simply too drunkenly merry to refuse. 3 men accepted the wager, though they agreed only to accompany Dick part of the way. They set off into the cold, their breath curling in the frigid air, and when they reached the north end of the old bridge, they halted. No further would they go. Dick shook hands with the 3 men, full of confidence, and arranged to return to the foul anchor in half an hour. They watched him vanish into the dark, his figure swallowed by the mist curling up from the water. And then, without a word, they turned and hurried back to the tavern, where the fire burned warm and the drink flowed fast. An hour passed, then 2. Midnight struck, and still Dick had not returned. The uneasy silence deepened. Men spoke in hushed voices, casting nervous glances at the door. One of the fellows, braver than the rest, suggested that they search for him immediately, but he could find nobody to second his motion. The name of the Shellycoat had already been uttered too many times that night, and no man dared to step out into the cold. The most he could accomplish was to suggest that they should remain together until the dawn, and then make the search at first light. He found no great difficulty in effecting this arrangement, as most of the party were too terrified to think of returning home alone, while others were quite content for having any reasonable excuse to stay here and drink a few more pints. And so they waited until the first grey slivers of dawn crept through the window panes. When at last they ventured forth, the shore was silent save for the distant cry of gulls and the sound of the waves licking hungrily at the stone. They arrived at the Shellycoat stain, and there, crumpled and insensible at its base, lay English Dick. He was alive, but barely. His body was severely and extensively bruised and battered. They carried him carefully back to the foul anchor, where medical attention was immediately sought. Both of his legs were found to be broken, along with a number of ribs. They watched as, throughout the day, he slowly, painfully returned to consciousness and regained his wits. But no matter how many times they asked, he would not speak a word of what had befallen him that night. As the weeks passed, English Dick gathered strength and was at length able, with the aid of crutches, to move out of doors. He invited those who had been present on the night of the wager to meet him once more at the foul anchor, in order to hear the narrative of his adventures. Their curiosity had been so long excited that they very eagerly accepted the invitation. As they gathered round to hear his story, rarely had the tavern, even when closed and empty, been so quiet. The firelight cast deep hollows beneath his eyes, and his hands trembled as he lifted his cup. At last he spoke.
"I was a fool,"
he admitted, his voice faltering.
"and I have paid for it. After I departed from you, I began to think I'd done a very foolish thing. After all, there might be such a thing as a Shellycoat, I thought, and I might have contented myself with doubting and denying his existence, without feeling the need to prove it in any such way. I never for a moment thought of coming back with a lie in my mouth, and telling you that I'd done what I'd not even tried. But I was afraid to encounter the scorn with which I knew I should be greeted if I were to confess that my courage had failed. And so, in an evil moment, I had resolved to proceed."
He told them how he'd reached the stone, his mind battling fear, his pride forcing him forward, how he had spoken the words in defiance.
Shellycoat, Shellycoat, gang away hame. I cry not for your mercy. I fear not your name.
For an instant or two, there was not a sound anywhere except for the waves lapping softly against the shore, the wind sighing through the grass. He had begun to laugh when suddenly the noise came.
It was like nothing I have ever heard. The most appalling sound, like 100,000 shells, grinding, clashing, rattling together as though carrying on a fierce tempest, spinning through the air with an uncontrollable fury. And then,
He swallowed hard.
from an indescribable sensation, I knew I was not alone. From the gloom, the outline of a giant, towering shape rose. It stood between me and the waves, and when it took one giant stride towards me, the rattling of the shells became deafening. I wanted desperately to flee, of course, but flight was impossible. And so it was all I could do to wait in silence for what was to follow. I didn't have to wait long.
The voice, he said, was soft, almost gentle, especially considering its monstrous size and form, but the words coiled around him like a noose.
Why have you summoned me?
It asked.
Why have you defied me?
Without waiting for a reply, he seized me by the shoulders, elevated me above his head, and in an instant we were flying through the air at a rapid rate, accompanied by the direful clattering of shells, which I could now see proceeded from a garment in which he was attired. In less time than I have taken to describe this flight, we reached an island which I took to be Inchkeith, and on the highest point of which I was set down. The Shellycoat now indulged himself in a prolonged laugh, or more properly speaking, yell, which echoed on the rocks of the Fife shore. Before I could notice any movement on the part of the spirit, I was hurled from my perch by a mass of earth, which, thrown with unerring aim, struck me square in the chest. I was lifted back to the spot where I'd been sitting, only to be driven from it again in a similar way. This was repeated 6 or 7 times, and I was utterly unable to offer even the slightest resistance. At length, I grew insensible. I cannot tell how long I remained in that condition, or to what further assaults I was subjected. That I had been tossed in the sea during this time was evident from the fact that I was dripping wet when I returned to consciousness, but I remember it not.
And then, as the first faint streaks of light began to appear in the east, he was once more lifted into the air, the world becoming a blur of shrieking wind and rattling shells. The last thing he saw was the Shellycoat stain far below, then rising to meet him at a terrible speed as the creature released him from his grip. He hit the stone with a crack, the impact stealing his breath from his lungs, and as he fell at last upon the earth, the demonic laughter followed him into the darkness.
I remember nothing more until I found myself in bed at the foul anchor,
He said. The fire crackled, and the shadows deepened.
I do not know why it spared me.
He went on.
I do not know what game it played, or what purpose it serves. But I know this.
He leaned forward, the firelight flickering in his hollow eyes.
The Shellycoat is very real, and never again will I be so foolish as to tempt his attention on me.
No one spoke. Nobody dared. The fire cracked softly, and from somewhere beyond the walls of the foul anchor, in the depths of the cold, dark sea, came the sound of shells shifting in the tide. It is reported that many people believed Dick's tale, but it's worth noting that one man did express some doubt as to its truthfulness. An old smuggler claimed that after leaving his companions, English Dick went straight to another pub, where he rather overindulged, before making his way back to the Shellycoat Stane, which he drunkenly attempted to climb. According to the smuggler, who claimed to be helping with the cargo at the time, English Dick, after falling off several times, eventually made it to the top of the Stane, where he began shouting and gesticulating rudely, before missing his footing and falling to the earth, breaking his legs in the process. It's also noted in Tales, Traditions and Antiquities of Leith that
it is proper to mention that the smuggler never ventured to repeat this version of his in Dick's presence, so after all it may merely have been a bit of banter.
You may draw your own conclusions. In the meantime, it's perhaps worth discussing what you should do if you ever have the misfortune of coming across one of these creatures. In Poems by Alan Ramsay with new additions and notes from 1733, the Shellycoat is described as
one of those frightful spectres the ignorant people are terrified at and tell us strange stories of, that they are clothed with a coat of shells which make a horrid rattling, that they'll be sure to destroy one if he gets not a running water between him and it. It dares not meddle with a woman with child.
So it would seem from this account that at least pregnant women need not fear the Shellycoat at all, and that everyone else, should they wish to escape one, should seek to get running water between the creature and themselves. Water, once considered holy, was said to form a barrier over which evil spirits and fae could not cross. Although, don't relax yet ladies, as shape-shifting male nixies are said to specifically target you in similar environments, and they have ways of luring you into treacherous waters. An interesting aspect of the Shellycoat that distinguishes them greatly from typical fairies and brownies is their confinement in some stories to a very limited area. The Leith Shellycoat, for example, was confined to the large rock known as the Shellycoat Stane, unless it was summoned out of it, in much the same way as a genie is traditionally confined to the lamp. The notable difference here being that nobody would wish for 2 broken legs and near fatal battery. So, first of all, if such a place is known, then take advice from the hard-learned wisdom of English Dick, and do not, under any circumstances, tempt the creature out. There is literally no telling what may happen to you if the Shellycoat really is, as Hutchinson contends, a perfect demon who possessed powers almost infinite. Hutchinson also contends that this creature would hide its coat beneath such a rock once its evil deeds were completed, at which point the Shellycoat's power would basically vanish. Unfortunately for the Shellycoat in the story of English Dick, the stone under which the Shellycoat resided
was blown to pieces on the formation of the docks, but tradition does not report whether or not the spirit succumbed tamely to the insult and injury. The probability is, and we charitably suggest it, that the Shellycoat's garment chanced to be under the rock at the time of its destruction, and thus he was forever after rendered invisible and harmless.
While some claim the rock was moved to a local sewage plant instead of destroyed, the fact remains that since that day, Shellycoat-related mischief in Leith has been in very short supply. Destroying the rock does indeed seem to be an effective preventative measure when it comes to Shellycoat management. Despite the differing accounts of the nature and temperament of the Shellycoat, there are through lines that remain consistent. Its association with rivers and coastal regions, in combination with its characterization as either a trickster spirit or a terrible guardian, warns people that bodies of water are unpredictable, potentially deceptive, and very dangerous, encouraging caution in these environments. Perhaps in an era where drowning was a common danger and river crossings were perilous, myths like the Shellycoat served as cautionary tales without necessarily invoking outright fear. Whether as a mere prankster or demonic force, the Shellycoat serves to remind people of how even the most ardent scepticism can be eroded by a question. Is the Shellycoat still out there? Is it possible to summon one, as English Dick claims to have done? And is it worth the risk to find out? In Leith, the Shellycoat's rock may well have been shattered and its legend faded into the pages of history, but if you ever find yourself near a river, hearing the distant rattle of unseen shells, would you dare to call its name? Thank you for joining me on this journey into the mythic past of Scotland and the borderlands. If you enjoyed the video, it would really help the channel if you could give it a like. Make sure to subscribe and set notifications so that you never miss another episode. Until next time, if you're ever enjoying a lovely walk by the river, listen carefully for the sound of rattling shells and dismal yells, especially if they're travelling upstream and against the current. And if someone should dare you to summon a water demon, just remember that the beasts of the old world may still roam wild today.